If God gives us suffering, why should we pray for healing? Well, there's a little bit of a twist on that question that I think is important for you to note. God doesn't give us suffering. God is not the author of suffering. He does not impose pain on us. It has to be filtered through His sovereign hands. In other words, there is a permissive will of God where our suffering is filtered through His hands, but always, always for a purpose. And prayer is the means by which God answers our concerns. As we read the scriptures, we hear God speak to us. As we pray, God hears us speak to Him. There is a two-way conversation going on as we are trying to discern exactly what the will of God and the purpose of God is in our suffering. So first of all, take into consideration that any suffering you're going through now has first had to have the permission of God, filtered through His hand into your life, but always, always for a purpose. Now, Paul would tell the Philippian church, he would say to the Philippian Christians, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." In other words, whichever side I end up on, whether I live or I die, my purpose is Christ. I live for that purpose, to serve Christ. And he goes on to talk to them about suffering. He says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." In other words, take what has been worked in you, that is the salvation that Christ alone gives, and work it out. Let it be demonstrated to the world around you. And sometimes that comes through the way in which we endure suffering. As we are experiencing pain and as we are experiencing heartache, we pray that God would take it away. We sometimes beg God to remove the pain and remove the sorrow from us. We pray for healing. We have friends and relatives and brothers and sisters who are going through horrific pain, and our hearts break for them. And so we beg God to remove that pain from them. And that is the means by which God tells us yes or no or wait. So we work out our salvation. What has been worked inside of us, we work it out in the context of life in this fallen world. And then he says this, "For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure." In other words, we exist for the purpose of reflecting back to a fallen world around us the love that God has for us. And we do so by asking for healing. God heals through answer to prayer. God heals, as James tells us, through the laying on of hands at times, where we call for the elders of the church and they anoint us with oil in obedience and in faith. We are trusting that God is going to use the mechanism of prayer, the mechanism of confessed sin, to bring healing to someone who needs it. So we don't ever stop praying for someone's healing, but we also pray with submission in mind. We pray in the context of knowing it may not be God's will to heal that person in this life. He may heal them in the life to come. Jesus Himself begged for another way, for the sin of the world to be dealt with. "Take this cup from me," He said. But then He was willing to endure that cup for the higher purpose of glorifying God. Then He says this in Philippians chapter 2, "Do all things," and that includes praying, that includes frustrated prayer, where we are wondering, why isn't God answering this prayer for healing? "Do all things without grumbling or disputing." In other words, we come to a place where we pray in submission, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Did you catch that? We are working out our salvation for a visible demonstration of a life that is ultimately submitted to the will and purpose of God. But at the same time, we are submitted to praying for those who are in terrible pain, and finding perhaps that we are the agents of that healing, that we are the ones that God is calling to go and minister that balm to that person who is hurting. So rather than asking whether or not we should pray for healing, because God is the God who is the author of that suffering, we need to rethink that and conclude that God is the one who filters our suffering through his sovereign hand. Suffering comes from the evil and the brokenness in this world. And we come to the place where we pray that God would bring healing, and maybe you are the agents of that healing to someone who is terribly broken and frustrated. He said, and hold fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. In other words, Paul's saying to these Christians, I want to be proud of the way in which you submit, proud of the way in which you reverence the will and the purpose of God. Don't ever stop praying for somebody's healing. Don't ever quit. You don't know whether or not God will heal them, but you know there is a purpose in their suffering. God is doing something incredible, and it may be in you. You may be the agent of that healing.